First, I want to thank the Institute, Father Lopez, and others for inviting me here, and it's particularly my pleasure to have in the audience former colleague of many years and great inspiration, David Schindler Jr., and also former student David Schindler Jr. here, as both of you here. So I'm really glad to be here, and it's a real pleasure and a real privilege to this. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, good. I want to begin my commentary on a resounding note of praise for this important and timely book. I must admit it's been my first encounter with the writings of Michael Hanby, and I regret that I didn't discover it sooner. For the first time, I felt I was reading someone who is deeply grounded in both traditional and contemporary theological conversation, who had also done the heavy lifting of reading the relevant primary and secondary literature dealing with evolution and its relation to philosophy and theology. He has taken into account the writings of scientists and those of philosophers and historians of life science who have been defining the contemporary secular discussions in these areas. In the end, I wish I'd written the book myself. It has altered my thinking about several issues of relevance, and it shows what kind of resources can be brought to the table by a Catholic theologian and philosopher approaching these questions from deep within the historic Catholic intellectual tradition. I was recently asked to address a local Catholic high school that was involved in a dispute between the science and theology faculties over whether they should be teaching intelligent design or theistic evolution to the students, with the theology faculty favoring the first and the science faculty the second. My answer, and I'm sure Michael Hanby would agree here, was neither. What I find clearly developed in this book are exactly the reasons why we as Catholics need to think in a wholly different way about these issues. What has been needed from Catholic voices, in my view, is a deeper theological engagement with the questions at issue in Michael Hanby's book, one that brings to bear the reflections of a long tradition of engagement with Greek and biblical sources and the writings of the great scholastic traditions upon questions raised by the contemporary sciences of life that sufficiently engages these in detail. The focus of the issue is particularly relevant to contemporary evolutionary theory and ongoing disputes related to it, concept of natural selection, the species problem, the units of selection question, relation of historical process to ontology, and this vexed issue of evolution and creation. These have all, in my view, been addressed and addressed deeply in this book. But since this is a critical commentary rather than a love feast, I will first offer some critical comments and points for further discussion. The basic plot line of Hanby's book is developed on what I might call a Gilsonian history of Western philosophy. In this narrative, we have the great tradition of Hellenic thought represented by Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Neoplatonism that is seen as laying down the key foundations concerning the concepts of being, form, substance, and teleology. These lines of thought were, however, unable to be brought to completion because of the absence of the Christian revelation and the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, in which the crucial distinction between esse and essentia was made possible. This Greek heritage is suddenly brought to some clarification through the Augustinian tradition, writings of the Fathers, further developed by Aquinas, whose massive 13th century synthesis was able to clarify the fundamental conception of the Hellenic framework and draw out its full Christian implications. This brings to fruit, in this view, the incarnational relation of God and the world developed upon the doctrine of creation, with the analogy of being as central in maintaining the distinction of creator and creation. It also brought to some completion the understanding of fundamental concepts like ensoulment, teleology, and substance in a form that integrated with the Christian revelation. This synthesis was followed, however, by the problems wrought by John Duns Scotus, who undermined the analogy of being, and then Occam and nominalism, which proceeded to reduce universals to concepts and destroy the inherent relatedness of things in the act of being. From then on, it just seems to be all generally downhill, with the results issuing in modern philosophical and scientific mechanism, in an externalized God-world relationship, and in a flat ontology of inert and disconnected matter governed by mathematical laws. This is first most forcefully articulated in Cartesianism and then extended by Newtonianism. And this set of events sets up both the artist-artifact model of God-world relationship, so important for the subsequent evolution debates, and also forms a foundation for the reductive mechanistic biology of the present. We have here a sharp dichotomy, in other words, between the thought of the ancients and moderns as a result. And Hanby develops this story, I should say, with considerably more subtlety than I presented it here. But I think it functions as the main axis of the arguments of the early chapters of the book. Now, I agreed indeed with some of this historical narrative, but it fails on two counts: to give us an accurate picture of the events of the early modern period and the way these have served as foundations for the subsequent discussions, particularly in the life sciences. The first problem in this philosophical narrative is to take account of the full richness of the heritage of antiquity and the alternatives posed in antiquity itself to some of the Aristotelian Platonic traditions outlined in this book. Now, this isn't just the familiar story of the old atomist tradition. Of greater relevance for the origins of modern life science is a substantial medical and anatomical tradition, particularly descending from the writings of Galen and his Islamic commentators. The developments within this tradition deeply affected both the theory and practice of life science inherited by the early modern thinkers. It also, and I underline this point, supplied many of the ingredients that Hanby has laid at the foot of modern mechanism, defined somewhat unusually in my view as, quotes, that they claim that parts of reality are ontologically prior to the whole of it. This does not set off a modern perspective on the organism. Indeed, it is within the inherited medical tradition from antiquity, exemplified again by the works of Galen, that we are presented with many of these same features of biological theory. We find in these writings, for example, when compared to those of Aristotle, a clear dissolution of the organism into a loose association of parts that can act even in opposition to one another. Second, we see a reinterpretation of biological causation that resembles aspects of modern biological mechanism. Key terms such as Aristotle's dunamis and energia, or typically potency and actuality, are reconceptualized in these writings as intrinsic proximate efficient causes, faculty and activity is the translation, that act only in loose and unknown relation to some unorganizing soul or psyche. The importance of this issue, which I'm developing here, is that we already have many of the ingredients of subsequent Cartesian approach to the organism as a cybernetic machine without inherent teleological action, with these actions the synthetic result of component parts. The features identified by Hanby as creations of modern biomechanism. In my view, Descartes simply mechanizes Galenic physiology in this view. A second point is related to this alternative medical heritage, as well as to a larger heritage of Stoicism that also affected, for example, Galen's writings. And this bears on the theological analysis supplied by Hanby. In his book, he places emphasis on the form of natural theology emerging in the 17th century, particularly among the British, with William Paley as in the 18th century as a central focus. This gives us a background of the evolution and creation debate. Now, while I would agree with the general argument he makes here, a more complete understanding of the historical roots of this line of argumentation again requires us to look more closely at the writings of traditions inherited from antiquity that have already extended this line of reasoning into the biological realm, again clearly illustrated in some of the works of Galen. This bears directly on the artifactual nature of the organism attributed by Hanby to the more moderns at this point. Now, although I can't develop the details here, we need to see that William Paley, for example, is only a placeholder for a set of theological assumptions of a tradition of argument that reaches back into antiquity. These are not simply creations of the moderns who in my view, mainly updated these arguments in the 17th century to create the tradition of British natural theology that Darwin argues against. What these details demand, in my view, is that we complexify our reading of early modern developments. They do not, however, alter the main thrust of Hanby's general argument concerning the defective theology involved in the evolution-creation debate. Now, in turning to this next section to specifically the discussion of Darwin in Chapter 5, entitled Darwin the Theologian, intriguingly, I found this a penetrating and accurate picture of Darwin's underlying theological and metaphysical commitments. What Hanby has brought out is the presence in so much evolutionary theology, theorizing, not only in Darwin, but in the tradition that has descended from his book, of a defective theology and metaphysics that is itself the source of the unending evolution and creation debates. The careful reader of Darwin, that I consider Hanby to be, is aware that he is neither a systematic philosopher nor a theologian of any sophistication. As one explores Darwin's reading lists, notebooks, and correspondence, it's clear that he does not engage the great sources or detailed arguments of the larger tradition. He doesn't read Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, or even Locke, Newton, and Descartes in the originals. What he knows of them is primarily gleaned from secondary commentators, sources that would not even make the footnotes of a history of 19th century philosophy. Now, Hume, Herschel, Kant, Humboldt, and Mill seem to be main exceptions to this, and these are works he has studied in greater detail. But this is never really a systematic study. It is surprising indeed that Darwin has been given such stature as a major philosophical heavyweight by many of his admirers. Now, I don't use that observation to belittle Darwin. I emphasize instead my great respect for him. He's one of the great observers of nature, a synthesizer of an enormous number of issues that had remained disconnected in the life science of his day. A one-time muddy boots field naturalist who observed detail that escaped many others observers, slight differences that others might have ignored, and he pulled together a vast and disparate body of inquiry. The misfortune I see in the heritage of Darwin's theory is that it was a theory conceived in the 1830s and 40s, but only published in the 1860s. There it quickly fell into a larger social and political context that was already debating scientific and philosophical naturalism. There were conflicts over higher biblical criticism. There were conflicts over colonialism, the meaning of the emerging technological society of late Victorian England. In the German states, particularly, it entered prominently into the Kulturkampf and became an instrument with which some sought to beat religion over the head. The result has been Darwinism as an ideological as well as scientific agenda pursued with avidity by such individuals as Ernst Heinrich Haeckel in Germany and Thomas Huxley in England in the 19th century, and is now being promoted anew by the ultra-Darwinians of today. The result of this historical circumstance has been largely disastrous, been the advocacy of Darwinian evolution as first philosophy, one that is offered as a replacement for the Abrahamic religious tradition in all its manifestations, the acclaimed defeater of classical metaphysics, a universal acid, that's Daniel Dennett's characterization, that dissolves traditional ethics, metaphysics, claims of human uniqueness, and, we might add, as Thomas Nagel and Hanby have argued, even scientific reason itself. For one familiar with this historical controversy, much of what we read today, I think, is no better than a replaying of old records on new machines with the addition of appeals to a body of empirical work that is assumed to confirm these negative theological and philosophical conclusions. Now, I feel in this book we have a very deep and substantial criticism of this whole line of argument that's correctly repositioned the questions on more adequate and philosophical and theological foundations. In the remainder of this commentary, I want to develop more positively some insights advanced by Michael Hanby in his 6th chapter entitled The Mystery of the Missing Organism. Here I suggest more strongly than he does that there are new opportunities presented here for some constructive dialogue with contemporary biological science, and I emphasize myself the need for such a constructive dialogue. In developing a critique of underlying assumptions of any branch of contemporary bioscience, this lays in part with the nature of scientific discipline formation itself. The formative culture of a worker in these areas, whether in evolutionary biology, molecular biology, biochemistry, cell physiology, neurophysiology, all of that, it's pervasively reductive and analytic. The result of simply routine instruction in subjects like biochemistry, physiology, genetics, and molecular biology. And here I can speak from personal experience. The result of that experience, that education itself shapes how one views living nature in a comprehensive way. It also is the key to the success of these sciences in developing new therapies and medicines. Now, against such a discipline-defined and paradigm-governed social institutional enterprise, what might seem as external criticisms from theology, sociology, or even philosophy, they're simply brushed aside as irrelevant. And I think nothing better illustrates this than the controversies over embryonic stem cell research, positions that might have and were articulated by Catholic theologians and ethicists, have encountered from the research community a response that such objections are simply based on subjective religious views alien to science's practice and that stand in the way of human betterment through science. Period. End of discussion. Now, to develop some kind of productive dialogue that goes beyond an external critique of philosophy and theology requires some penetration of the issues from the inside. If we want to do more than hammer on a granite wall, we have to find productive ways to do this. And I actually suggest that issues raised in Hanby's discussion in Chapter 6 offer some opportunities for doing this that he doesn't fully explore. In this chapter, he's engaged, and again, I'm impressed by the depth of his reading in this material. New developments in biological theory itself. These are generally captured under the banners of such names as developmental systems theory, evolutionary developmental mechanics, or evo-devo, and the new emphasis on form and structure and integration of the organisms. These are trends emerging within biological science itself from some exciting new work. Hanby's comments on these developments are sympathetic, but also critical of the somewhat shallow metaphysical underpinnings of much of the theory involved. While I don't question his judgment of these deficiencies when the work is placed against a long and rich tradition of metaphysical inquiry into form, order, organism, and life, it seems important to recognize that these new options are arising from within scientific and disciplinary inquiry itself. The Human Genome Project, for example, has forced new level of attention to issues of what are called epigenetics. There's new emphasis being given to the role of top-down causation in organic function. There are new inquiries into the sources of development and evolutionary change that take on aspects of a supposedly discredited Lamarckianism. The concept of the gene has been enormously expanded beyond the simplistic views developed in early genetics that became fundamental to neosynthetic evolutionary theory and which have given us rise to such things as Dawkins' selfish gene theory. There are new concepts emerging in evolutionary biology and ecology, robustness, niche construction, developmental plasticity, that imply a goal-seeking, dynamic nature of the organism. These can be seen to be recognitions in different language of traditional concern, with formal and imminent final cause. These internal developments, moving slowly but deliberately from the periphery of life, science to the center, are in response to a failure of traditional reductive mechanism and gene-centered understandings of the organism to solve its own problems. In this, I see the potential for a new kind of dialogue between traditional philosophy and science in the next stage that's already been initiated in part by such scientific authors as Mary Jane West Eberhard, Scott Gilbert, Stuart Newman, and many others critical of current biological orthodoxy. So it seems to be, rather than emphasize the philosophical weakness of some of these formulations, I suggest we're better served by finding modes of translation and redescription that can assist us and the sciences themselves in developing these insights and their consequences. It has to be done with care and attention to detail, such as that I think that Michael Hanby has demonstrated. But I think there's a clear opening here for a kind of productive interchange. So moving past this fictitious evolution-creation dispute that I think Hanby has exploded, we can turn attention more closely to those emerging developments in life sciences. A critical Aristotelian view of the organism may just happen to be correct, in spite of those scientific developments that have taken place over the last 400 years. What we need are the conceptual tools and language to be able to develop these insights in dialogue with the sciences, as well as with philosophy, theology, and metaphysics. Now, from the standpoint of the Christian philosophical vision that Michael Hanby has presented of creation as a gift, it is clear that the reigning analytic vision of life does not and even cannot abolish the purposeful, teleological, holistic aspect of life that transcends our scientific understanding. Organic analysis and biomechanism necessarily presuppose, as he highlights, this holistic reality. To use Michael Polanyi's useful distinctions, our life science typically has made the former analytic view of life focal and the latter holistic view of life subsidiary. But we can, and for practical, ethical, and religious life must, shift our focal attention to the organismic level, to the level of real things acting in nature, to human beings existing as creatures capable of love, artistry, worship, and encountering the world as knowers from our unique, upright posture. The mechanisms of our biology need not be denied here. They simply describe the material and efficient causes of life and the necessary conditions that make life possible. And I think as Hanby brings out beautifully in his chapter 8, where he draws attention to the phenomenological dimensions of knowing life, we are forced to recognize that, quote, inwardness, which we know in ourselves and through which we know anything else, unquote. This both confirms the giftedness of life and the conditions of the possibility of science itself. I want to thank Michael Hanby for illuminating my own thinking on many of these points and offering a creative way of reconceiving the framework of contemporary biology from a substantial theological and metaphysical perspective. He does not deny the insights of modern science into the nature of life, but nonetheless, he highlights in the way in which, properly viewed, creation is an astonishing gift by a creator who works not through fashioning artifacts and tinkering with species, but through an abiding gift of love that sustains and gives being to all things, even the organisms and processes described by evolutionary theory and molecular biology. Thank you.